All right, you who just pressed play, here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. If this happens to be your first time here, let me welcome you. Everyone else, what's up? How was your week? Is it just me, or did it feel like this week went by quicker than other weeks? Time is a funny thing. Sometimes it feels like it's speeding up. Sometimes it feels like it's slowing down. Sometimes it feels like it goes away. Well, it's just racing by these days. I've been thinking a lot about time and the way things come round and round again. It's so crazy that I'm opening a yoga center right now. Most of you listening to this who are regular listeners for sure know. If you're newer, you might not know. I'm opening a yoga center. The last time I opened a yoga center was in 2007. And boy, trying to wrap my mind around time and sort of being back in a similar pattern or engaging in something that I engaged in my past again now. Like last time I did it, I was in my 30s and now I'm in my 50s. And it's just such a different experience, and yet it's the same thing. I'm doing it again, but it's so different because everything is so different now. And then, most of you also know that I'm a parent, and my wife went with my youngest daughter to my in-laws' place for a few days. So I've been alone with my eldest daughter, who's 14, and interacting with her and thinking about her as a little kid, because when she was really, really little, it was at a time where her mom had this job that got us health insurance. So she was working quite a bit when Roslyn, my eldest daughter, was at a certain age from like 2 to 4. And I spent a lot of time with her. And it was like spending time with her again now. And she's like a almost coming on adult now. And it's so wild. And so time's just really been something on my mind. And my talk today with Stephen Cope plays right into that, because around the time that I had the yoga center, not too long after I opened it, is when I read Yoga and the Quest for the True Self, which I imagine many of you listening to this have also read. And I don't know why it's taken me so long to have Stephen on the show, but it made a lot of sense that it was now, because someone like Stephen, who has a vantage point on everything that's happened in the yoga world, is a kind of person who I look to get some kind of clarity or affirmation of what I have observed. So this show started out of me wanting to make sense of what was happening in the yoga world and my role in it, whatever that was, and how we got here, how we got from it being this counterculture thing to this like kind of celebrity thing. Like I was trying to make sense of that. And someone like Stephen, who was part of the generation that brought yoga into the mainstream, is someone who can speak to these things in a way that it makes me feel like I'm not crazy. Like I did actually see this all happen. It did happen. I did have a yoga center in 2007, and you could just put a A-frame sign out front that said yoga, and then people would just show up. And not only that, it still felt like yoga centers were important, and you weren't feeling like you were coming up against the fitness thing so much as now. Like it still felt like a place for people to inquire into mystical wisdom traditions. And so it was perfect timing right as I'm opening this center and I'm trying to find the inspiration I need to create this place, and the insecurity of wondering whether or not the people who live here are actually interested in inquiring into a wisdom tradition or if they just want to work out, or even if that needs to be discussed, like maybe it's just unspoken underneath the practice we're doing. But even still, if someone wants to come sweat and I want to have a contemplative practice, they're probably not going to be into it, you know? So in any case, all the little details that I was talking about last week, like paint colors and, lighting and all that stuff still happening. But at the same time, I've really been wanting to wrap my mind around what is the driving mission, or what is my hope for this place. And having a conversation with Stephen Cope about his experience at Kripalu and observing what's happened. And he's got a new book called The Dharma in Difficult Times, which has very much to do with finding direction and purpose in this crazy time that we're living in. So it all came together perfectly, and it was wonderful to have a chance to speak with him. I'm very glad to be sharing it with you today. Real quick before we get to it, let me mention that I have a new teacher training group starting online in October. So if you're a teacher looking to revive your passion for deep inquiry into yoga, or you're newer to teaching, or you're not a teacher and you're thinking about becoming a teacher and you want to fill out your knowledge base, and you enjoy listening to this show and feel like you connect with me some, then maybe my teacher training program is right for you. I have a new group starting in October. Other than that, I've got my ongoing regular stuff. There's live classes online. There's a weekly discussion group. There's on-demand videos. Or maybe you want to get into the full-length archives of this show and become a supporter with a podcast premium subscription. All of my stuff can be found at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, y'all, let's leave it there. I will touch base with you on the other side, but let's go ahead and get into it. Let's listen to this conversation that I had with Stephen Cope. Hello?
Hello, Jay.
Hello, Stephen.
How are you, my friend?
I am very well, sir. Very nice to meet you. Thank you so much for taking my invitation up and making this time today. I really appreciate it.
I'm always glad to have a chat.
I really appreciate it. And I am already recording. And if it's okay with you, I'd like to consider us having just begun. Is that all right?
Absolutely fine. Absolutely fine. Hey, Jay, tell me, where are you?
Right now, I am in Easton, Pennsylvania.
Okay.
Which is just on the other side of the Delaware River from Phillipsburg, New Jersey.
Okay, got it.
It's like the first city on the Delaware side, on the other side, on the Pennsylvania side, closest to New York City.
Okay.
Long-standing rivalry between Easton High School football and Phillipsburg High School football on the other side of the river. We learned when we moved here.
Yeah. That's funny.
And Easton has a couple of claims to fame, actually. One, it's one of three places that the Declaration of Independence was read out loud.
No kidding. Wow.
Yeah, Thomas Edison lived down the street, so it has like some historical roots.
Uh-huh. So you're not that far from Philadelphia then?
No, probably about an hour's drive.
An hour from Philly. Okay.
I guess the other claim to fame is the baseball bats, Easton baseball bats, if anybody's a baseball player.
I remember Easton baseball bats from a long time ago.
Well, there you go. Well, yeah. I remember you from a long time ago, Stephen. Bringing us to our conversation today. It's really wonderful to get a chance to speak with you. I imagine a lot of the kind of core listeners of this show who are people who are like of my generation or even older maybe are familiar with you because we all still have like a bookshelf somewhere with all of our yoga books.
Yes.
And there's a slightly yellowing copy of Yoga and the Quest for the True Self on there.
Absolutely.
And it was a pretty significant book for me.
Huh, interesting.
I didn't read it until I think a few years after it was published, probably more around 2005 or 2006.
Yeah, yeah.
But it was a time, and we've talked about this on the show quite a bit, where folks like myself had kind of gotten into yoga maybe like in the late 90s,
Hmm.
and suddenly, it's 5 years later, 6 years later, and we're actually kind of making a living, like we're paying our rent teaching yoga.
Yeah, yeah.
And it kind of went from this like counterculture underground thing that your parents were worried about when you told them,
Yeah, yeah.
to kind of being like considered more of a career or a profession. Like there was like Nike ads with yoga now, and stuff was kind of crashing into the mainstream, it seemed.
Absolutely.
And many of us were looking to kind of have ways to kind of legitimize what we were doing, I think,
Yeah,
or to
yeah.
have ways of talking about what we were doing.
I
That
remember that time so well, that moment when things in the yoga world really began to get mainstream. I arrived at Kripalu in 1989 when yoga was still very much on the periphery of things. And I'd, of course, been through all kinds of sophisticated psychoanalytic training and stuff. And it was a little bit of a secret that I was into meditation and yoga. And it wasn't something that you would brag about in professional circles. And now, what, 25, 35 years later, uh, it's integrated so profoundly into, I mean, you go to Harvard Medical School or Tufts or whatever, and it's integrated there. Yoga and meditation are.
Yes, very interesting. And I know for myself, coming from like a Western perspective or being born in America,
Mm,
but then embracing yoga as like a lifestyle choice, like really I had some transformative experiences early on that really shaped and kind of ignited some passion for yoga, I think.
yeah.
And you seemed to be providing this Western psychological lens by which to kind of understand some of these things. And I think a lot of people like myself found that incredibly helpful. I'm also remarking to myself how, I have been doing this show for 8 years, and I'm like, why is it taking me so long to have Stephen on the show until now? And
Uh,
I kind of sometimes feel like there's certain reasons why that happened that I can't explain.
uh-huh.
But I do think that talking to you now, I'm I have different kinds of questions than I would have asked you
Mhm.
if we had talked even a few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago.
Very much so. It's funny. You know who Bessel van der Kolk is, a
Yes.
friend of mine, and um, he loved the yoga and the quest for the true self. And a few years ago, he asked me to come in and speak at his big annual conference in Boston, and I said, Bessel, I have moved so far beyond that book. And I haven't read it in 20 years. I'm not even sure what's in it. And Bessel said, "Oh, you mean to say I'm stuck in your past?" And I said, "Yeah, that's a good way of putting it." Because I got into yoga, and it's, of course, I made the bridge between my professional world and my training and the great psychologies of the East. But I've really moved far beyond that in the last 35 years, 40 years.
Well, it's interesting to hear you say that, and I'm curious to hear a little bit more about that. But before we get to where we are now, I am a little bit curious about where you came from, because I did, in preparation to speak with you, like, see what I could find out about you. And you have a Wikipedia page, and I don't always trust everything on Wikipedia pages. But there were a few things on there I was curious about, in particular, given like what I was saying about the kind of questions I'm curious about now, and the
Yeah,
kind of Eastern mind and Western mind, and where they intersect and where they don't.
yeah.
So I guess I read that you were born in Ohio. Your dad was a historian and a dean at
Mhm.
Worcester College. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, that's correct.
And I read that you went to study as a priest at a divinity school. Is that true?
That's absolutely true. Yeah.
So did you grow up in a religious household? Like, how old were you when you decided you wanted to go into the priesthood, and what was motivating that?
Yeah. I grew up in a very Midwestern Protestant household. So my family were Quakers on one side and Presbyterians on the other, and not particularly devout. But even as a kid, I was absolutely fascinated with and drawn into the liturgy of the church and the music. It just so happened my father was dean of the college then, and we had a brilliant musician who led the choir and the worship in the college chapel. So we were treated with Bach cantatas and Mozart and, the Messiah at Christmas. I was completely drawn into sacred music. I studied the piano from the time I was about 5 and became a pretty accomplished pianist. So I was interested in the music, and that's what really drew me into Western spirituality. And then when I was in high school, I lived in Europe with my family. My father was writing a book in Spain, and I was drawn into the amazing mystical theology of Catholicism in Spain. So I've always had a penchant for spiritual stuff, no matter how old I've been. And then I went through college and graduate school, and that longing to connect with spirit was always really strong. So while I was in graduate school at Boston College, I got involved with Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, the great crazy wisdom guru of the Tibetan tradition.
Slightly controversial figure, I would say,
Oh,
yes.
yeah, absolutely. Very controversial. But you know what? This guy was a monk who escaped from Tibet, walked over the mountains, went to Oxford, became highly educated, and wrote some of the really first essential books for translating Buddhism to the West. Brilliant guy who somehow along the way became an alcoholic and, was at root a kind of a crazy wisdom guru. Nonetheless, his practice, his people, really were devout practitioners of meditation, of Buddhism, of meditation, particularly of Vipassana. And so I had very little to do with the hierarchy of that tradition, but the actual nuts and bolts, the people on the ground who were meditating were very earnest. And so that's where I learned to meditate. And I was just so I was drawn into the genius of Buddhism, to the spiritual genius and the psychological genius of the Dharma. And so for those years when I was with Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, I was on fire for the Dharma. And it's a wonderful thing, really. It I was also in seminary at the time, and I became extremely disillusioned with seminary, with Western spirituality, because it was all in the head. There was very little practical spirituality. Like, how do you pray? How do you meditate? How do you connect with God? Most of it was very much about theology and up in the head. And then I was presented with this juicy tradition, which is all about the heart and practice and daily practice and how do you live it in your life. And so I was in my late 20s then, and I was just drawn into the Eastern contemplative traditions strongly.
So you just completely let go of your earlier, affection for the Christianity, just went Eastern spirituality instead.
I never totally let go of it. I've always been very respectful of the Christianity, and its mystical roots are very profound. So I'm very drawn to the mystical writers of the 14th, 15th, 16th century, like the Cloud of Unknowing and so forth. That's very profound stuff. So I didn't eschew that. But in terms of where the church is, the Christian church is these days, you never hear that stuff. You don't hear that in sermons.
Yeah, that's true. I think for myself, even I grew up in a Jewish household in the 80s in Los Angeles, and I was a
Wow.
bar mitzvah, but my experience of Judaism was so hypocritical and superficial. It kind of sullied it all for me. And it's interesting, and maybe we can talk about this more later, but I have kind of been engaging with the Bible and Jesus in a way that's not at all connected to church, but just like in the same way I've, looked into the Bhagavad Gita. And I think I've really never done that before because I like rebelled against the religion of my parents or whatever. And it was safer for me to like embrace Eastern spirituality in certain
Yeah,
ways.
right.
Um,
That
well,
makes, go ahead.
no, I was going to say, I guess so you're at school, you were in seminary because you were inspired by the music, and then you are exposed to Buddhism. And when you get out of school, how do you get from there to Kripalu, or what is there a lot that happens in between there?
There's a lot. So,
Yeah.
first of all, I was at Episcopal Divinity School, which is a very Tony theological school affiliated with Harvard. So I was right there with all the Harvard folks at Harvard Divinity, and that was wonderful and heady. And so when I graduated, I got my degree. I practiced psychotherapy for 10 years in Boston. And that was pretty wonderful. I mean, I was able to get into Freud and real depth psychology from the Western point of view, which has a tremendous amount to recommend it. And I'm still fascinated by it. So I never really jettisoned that. But I did get, through those 10 years when I was practicing psychoanalytic psychotherapy, I just got more and more drawn to the genius of the Eastern contemplative tradition's view on the mind. And it's just so much bigger, so much more vast than the Western idea of mind. And therefore, to me, just more interesting. So I never really let go of my interest in the West, but I was just powerfully drawn to the East. So the reason I got to Kripalu is I decided to take a year-long sabbatical and really investigate my interest in meditation and yoga and so forth. And I actually had a choice at that point. I was either going to go to a monastery, a Christian monastery, which is affiliated with Harvard right there on the banks of the Charles, or I was going to go to Kripalu. And my buddy said, who loved Kripalu, said, look, all those monks, they overeat and they overdrink and they get fat. Go to Kripalu, right?
They
So,
serve you vegetarian food and everybody's
yeah,
healthy.
exactly. It's so healthy. So I did. I went to Kripalu for a year as a year sabbatical, and I never returned after that. I was just so drawn in. And at that point, Kripalu, was still fairly young. There were 350 or 400 of us yogis there, dressed in white, living a real ashram life with a real guru, getting up at 4:30, practicing, all morning, and then doing seva or selfless service during the
Yeah,
day.
just to interrupt you for a second, I had Kamini Desai on, and she talked
Oh,
about
oh,
she
yeah.
talked about the early days and her dad and stuff. So we have heard about some of that before, but you were there. Do you know like how many years in were you there, or how early on did you get involved?
Yeah, I got there in 1989. And at that point, yoga was just emerging onto the national scene more. And Amrit Desai was brilliant, um, powerful guru, authentic guru. And of course, Kamini is his daughter. And at that time, Kripalu had a small but really powerful group of renunciates that were really practicing intensively. And it was the real thing. There was a lot of authentic, earnest practice going on. And that just drew me in. And they were interested in me because I had this connection to Western psychotherapy and the Western mind. So I found a role for myself right away in making this relationship there.
Mm.
Um, And I got there in 1989. We booted out the guru in 1994.
Now, wait a second. Before we boot out the guru, I
Yeah,
read another thing in the Wikipedia page that I don't know is true, but I'm
yeah,
curious about. It referenced you having like a shaktiput experience.
that's true. I did. Yeah,
Because I just had somebody on the show this week talking about that, and he was like a total skeptic, and he was India, and some teacher like
yeah,
bopped him on the head, and like for 3 days he had this whole thing happen. He completely changed him.
yeah.
Did you have that happen with Amrit Desai?
I did. So my buddy, who I told you said go to Kripalu, said, I'm taking you there for a weekend in September. We went, and it just so happened that the guru was giving something called Vandana, which is a special ritual in which you offer gifts and he gives you a blessing. And you crawl on your knees up to the front of the room. And I had no idea about what any of this was. I was a complete newbie. I never heard the word Shakti. I had no idea. So I had no bias. But I crawl up and I give him my apple or whatever I gave him, and he bopped me on the head. And dude, I was in an altered state for days, possibly weeks. Uh, a state in which everything was absolutely okay. Um, I came back to Boston. I'll never forget it. I had no explanation for it. I didn't understand it at the time.
Yeah, how did your psychologist mind process that?
It totally didn't. It totally like was completely confusing, but so delightful because it was just this profound sense of contentment. Everything is absolutely okay. It's maybe a kind of a mini experience of what Eckhart Tolle talks about in his enlightenment experience, or a kind of mini satori. But and clearly it had something to do with the energy, the shakti of the guru. So I got like, well, that's real. That's not just esoteric, nonsense. That's actually real. And who knows how it changed my life, my mind. I don't know, but I do know I thought, okay, this is real. This is fascinating. I cannot not investigate this more. So that was the point where I decided I'm going to go there for a year, right? However, it took me 2 years to leave my very long-term psychotherapy practice because I had these long-term patients and you have to do it properly and end with them. So it took 2 years before I could actually get to Kripalu, and I finally got there when I was 40 years old. And as Amrit Desai would have told you back in that day, if you'd come to Kripalu in 1989, you would have seen 350 very earnest, mostly Americans, Westerners, dressed in white, practicing all of the 8 limbs of yoga, working really hard, playing really hard, and a community with a genius about what I call group mind. That is to say, the power of making decisions as a group and utilizing every member of the group in some way, using all the gifts, right? So it was pretty heady in those days. And then, of course, in 1994, it
Well,
exploded.
did you think of Amrit Desai as your guru? Did you like was he thought of as a god man, or like how was he placed in
He
people's
was thought
minds?
of as a god man by many people. So keep in mind, I arrived there when I was 40, and I was already a pretty mature man.
Yeah.
So I really didn't ever believe any of the hype about the divinity of a guru or the quasi divinity.
Even after he bopped you on the head and you had the
Even after he
experience.
popped me on the head, I never really believed that he was in any way a super normal human being. Um, as many people did, absolutely did. And that those maybe myths or who knows what extended even more so to his guru, Swami Kripalu, who
Mm,
was truly a spiritual genius and probably enlightened.
mm.
Uh, and it was said that Babaji had no internal organs because they'd all been completely purified. And there was a good edge of magical thinking in that day, none of which I really bought into. So when he
But
turned
that was
out,
what Kripalu was about back then.
yeah,
That's
totally,
yeah.
totally. But when it turned out that he had feet of clay, I just thought, oh, he's got feet of clay. He's a human
Did
being.
you have suspicions that he wasn't, there was issues before it all came out? Did you witness him acting in ways that seemed suspect to you?
No, never.
Mm.
Um, but I did, because of my training, I originated this whole year-long series of symposia on psychotherapy and yoga, into which we invited some of the top psychotherapists in America for a whole year. We had um, every quarter we had a symposium, and then at the end we had a big conference. And over the course of that time, Jay, um, there was a lot of questioning of the guru and his power and influence, and a lot of the projections started getting seen through. People started realizing that they, out of their longing for the all-knowing, all-seeing guru, they were projecting onto this guy. And that started to break down over the course of that year. And I think those symposia were a big part of that. So that by the end, it ended in May with the big conference. Things really began to break down, and by September we had all the revelations of the bad conduct.
Right.
And at that point, we and the board asked him to leave, right? But I never thought he was divine, so I never thought he was evil. I didn't buy either side of that equation.
I mean, I have to say, talking to Kamini certainly humanized him in a way that I hadn't had an experience of before, because he's just this name, Amrit Desai, who did another one of the fallen gurus or whatever. Probably the first one I ever heard about. There's been many, many throughout history and many since. But that's interesting. So you were there when he was asked to leave. And I think that is a question I've often asked about, because it seems like when the whole tradition or the whole community is built on a spiritual figurehead, on a guru, and then the guru is shown to not be everything he was, or he falls from the grace that he was put in, and he leaves, and then people try to pick up the pieces. Sometimes there aren't any pieces to pick up, or you can't. Can you separate the teacher from the teachings is the question. And how did you all do about that? Did you just start from scratch, or how did you sort out what was universal about it? I'm curious about the process of reinventing Kripalu.
Well, that was really interesting. But first, let me say that there was in that moment an opportunity for the community to really mature and say, oh, if you want to have a guru, you have to have people who want to be disciples. It takes two to tango in this case. And so what's our role in this? Well, our role is our projections onto this guy and our longing for that omniscient, all-knowing, all-seeing dude. And at that point, there was the possibility that we could have used that moment to grow as a community, that he could have used it to step into a more realistic posture of relationship with us. And we did ask him to, I believe we asked him to go into therapy, to step back from his duties. We had a whole list of requests, some of which he had complied with and others of which he didn't. And so to me, that was a lost opportunity, that moment, right? So it didn't happen that way. What did happen was, as you might expect, the people who thought of him as omniscient and now it had been seen through were pissed off, were upset, were alienated, and left. So like a whole level of the most senior disciples or the most senior people just left. And what was left was pretty much a core of us who were not the senior people, more people like me, right, who saw the possibility of recreating this community, no longer around the guru model, but we became a 501c3, we became an educational organization, we dropped our religious status. And it took quite a few years for what I will call the remnant of us to rebuild Kripalu around uh, very much the same kind of yogic principles without the guru, um, and much more in a kind of an educational frame in which it sits now very happily. And there was a period of time, Jay, where you've been to Kripalu, right? Have you
I have.
seen?
In fact, I taught there for a few years, right around 2012 to 2015. I had like a champion in the programming department who got me some
Oh,
slots.
how cool!
But I never managed to get the number with target number was always something like 15, and I was always getting 12. And then there was a shift, especially when Lipsius came in later. We could talk about that. That I no longer had my champion at Kripalu, and I lost my gig there.
Damn,
Yeah.
dude, yeah, I totally get that. That's too bad. I do remember your teaching there. I do remember you. We may
Interesting.
have met then.
Hmm.
But at any rate, um, it took us. There were years when nobody would come there because the scandal had tarred the whole thing with one brush.
Hmm.
And so it was during those years that I wrote Yoga and the Quest for the True Self. I wasn't doing anything else, but I was determined to make sense of what had just happened. And as you know from reading the book, there's quite a bit about that epic
Yeah.
in there. Um, and it was the perfect time to write a book. So that's when I wrote the book.
I mean, I can really relate to that because I have fancied myself a bit of a writer over the years, but I've never written like a full book like that because I've always felt like you would need that thing about going to the cabin in the woods so you can just focus on the book. I kind of
Yeah,
get that. So
yeah,
having spent some time at Kripalu where the meals are prepared, like I
yeah.
never eat so much salad as when I at
No,
Kripalu because I don't have to prep the vegetables. You know what I'm saying? Like I get how that would have been a very supportive place
fabulous. Oh my
to
God.
write and contemplate and process everything that was
Yeah,
happening. And
yeah,
it does seem like a pretty big transformation happened because by the time I got there,
yeah,
Kripalu would really be reinvented. I remember it being like the first place to kind of have like bigger bodies on their cover of their thing. It was one of the
right.
first places to kind of have get away from the yoga body thing and really kind of
Yeah,
make moves there. I really appreciated that. I
yeah,
guess the other question I have about the kind of reinvention is I was always curious about the kind of the philosophical or spiritual basis by which it was because it seemed like Amrit was coming from an ascetic tradition. That's why the ashram was the way that it was, and that's why he got in trouble, maybe. But later on, it does seem like the philosophy, like if you went to the Kripalu site and you read about Kripalu after the reinvention, it was a different philosophical basis. And I'm curious about that. Were you involved in those conversations around like, okay, well, if it's not Amrit Desai, is it still rooted in Swami Kripalu? And were you able to kind of separate out the teachings of Swami Kripalu and the philosophical traditions that it comes from Amrit Desai?
absolutely. Yeah. And, there was a small group of us who were very involved in all of that. And it was not hard to shift from Amrit to Swami Kripalu because Swami Kripalu is a true scholar of the yoga tradition and has written commentaries on all the major scriptures. Also, Swami Kripalu spent a lot of his life living and teaching among householders, going from village to village. He was very interested in the householder life and what we call in yoga the four ashramas, right? Brahmacharya, grihastha, vanaprastha, and sannyas. But really understanding the power uh, of grihastha, of the householder stage, and the next stage, vanaprastha, the hermitage phase. So he was not primarily never became a monastic monk. He was teaching in the community. And so it was very easy to begin to integrate some of his profound teachings on the Gita, on the Yoga Sutra, the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, all of it, um, into a more mainstream kind of eight limb path basis for our teaching. Yeah, so that wasn't really that hard, and it continues to today. There are a few individuals who have really taken this to the max, like Shoban, Richard Faulds, who's become the scholar of Swami Kripalu, his life and his teachings. And Richard is just now putting out a three-part series, 3 books on this, and a lot of it is about how to live a householder life.
I mean, it's interesting to hear you say that because honestly, back in the day when I saw what Kripalu was doing, I really liked it, but I always had it in mind that it was more of a marketing thing.
Yeah,
That you know what I mean? That like it had to become about householders
right,
because
right.
everybody who had the money to go to Kripalu was a householder. They were going for the weekend. They were going for the 5 days. And I remember the kind of the world of the staff and the world of the participants and the way that they cycle. You know, you've got the 5 day events and then the
Yeah,
weekend events.
yeah,
That
that's
that
right.
that convention of like the Learning Institute. I also spent time at Omega Institute.
Yeah.
Like there was that kind of element, but it does seem like you were one of the people who were like, we're in it for the soul and the philosophy, not necessarily the marketing, but it must have played a role.
Oh, it did play a role. You know, an interesting part of the story, Jay, is that Dina Bandhu and Ela Sarli were absolutely pivotal to making our shift between the ashram and Kripalu as we have it now. They also were absolutely pivotal in developing Omega. They went to Omega for 10 years.
Mm.
And so they've had a huge hand in developing retreat centers that speak to the needs of kind of mainstream people. At Kripalu and Swami Desai's and Yogi Desai's day, there was a renunciate group, you know, that wore the saffron robes and took vows, and it wasn't large, but I don't know, maybe it was 25 people. But there was always the sense that those were the real practitioners, and that you really aspired at some point to become a renunciate yourself. So it was it had the momentum of a kind of monastic tradition, and that's what left when Amrit left. There was no more pretense about that, and there was no more renunciate group either.
Interesting. Although it's funny because the word renunciation has come to mean different things to me now over the years. As we were talking about the very beginning, I used to think of the idea of renunciation as kind of being a denial of the life that's been given, or like, at least if it wasn't a denial, a path where you didn't have to engage with the temptations of the world or whatever. But
Yeah,
now I realize that in certain ways, renunciation, it's about choices that you make to abstain from certain things because it keeps you closer to God or something equivalent. And
exactly.
that I do a lot of. I'm abstaining from a lot of things that I
Yeah.
could be doing. And that is about lifestyle. And I know you played a role at developing, I don't know, I can't remember the name of it, but it was like a lifestyle program at Kripalu.
Well, the Institute for Extraordinary Living, is that what you're talking about?
Perhaps that's what I'm
Yeah,
thinking of.
that's what I founded along with Sudbir Khalsa from Harvard, something called Kripalu Institute for Extraordinary Living, which was mainly interested in helping people find their dharma, their path in the world. And that's why I
Mm.
became so interested in the Bhagavad Gita, because when the Gita was written, somewhere in the first couple centuries of the either the Common Era or before the Common Era, we're not exactly sure when. Renunciation was the path of spirituality, right? And the Gita ushered in this whole new era where you could have a full, passionate spiritual life and be in the world, be in the marketplace. Um, and and the 4 pillars that I write about, discern your dharma, do it full out, let go of the fruits, that is, there's your renunciation, let go of the outcome, and do it full out. Those are the 4 pillars of dharma in the Gita. So rather than, so this reframed the idea of renunciation. We're no longer renouncing action per se. Now we're renouncing the fruit of action, right? So we renounce our clinging to success or money or fame.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.